Hey guys, alright, so we need to cover a few things about the revolutionary period, including nationalism and some other reforms going on. So, quick video on that, and then I will be doing another one on Ottoman and Russian reforms. So, get your notes out. At the top, it should say Social Changes and the Rise of Nationalism. And essentially, what we're looking at are a series of revolutions and reforms. They come after the French Revolution and the independence era, and all of them are a result of, in some ways, the failures of those revolutions to go far enough socially. But also, what those revolutions do is make the opposing ideologies of these time periods more evident than they've ever been before. So it's not to say that ideas that are liberal and ideas that are conservative have never existed before in history, but now they are more evident, right? As the revolutionaries had a cause, right? Had a movement, were physical, and had demands, and now the opposite side, the royal families or the upper classes, threatened by that, have something to react to. So now we actually have terminologies and schools of thought to identify these opposing ideologies. We're giving them terms. So conservatism and liberalism, right, are the terms that are now being thrown around. On your notes, you'll see a portrait of Edmund Burke, who is considered the father of modern conservatism, and on the opposite side, John Stuart Mill, who is considered the father of modern liberalism, which the essential concepts that the conservatives want no change or slow-paced change, whereas many of the liberals are looking for quicker change. Some of those changes that align with the Enlightenment, looking for more social qualities to uphold natural rights more fervently, and things of that nature. So all these are coming together. And essentially what's happening is that people have more of a voice, and this also goes back to technologies. With the telegraph, with improved printing and better transportation, we're simply getting more people involved. And so as these ideas begin to move about via these technologies and with more of a voice, it's no longer just upper class intellectuals debating these things, but now more people getting their hands on this, including women, including the lower classes, which will lead to women's rights movements, which will lead to civil rights movements for slaves, as well as the 1848 revolutions, which are popular revolutions that will take the streets. They'll ultimately fail, but they will open a bigger conversation about what people want their nations to look like, and what a middle class should look like, and what the lower classes should deserve, or they should grow, and all that type of stuff. So let's get to a couple of those topics. Do you see my cat? She's walking around. All right, bye. So the abolition movement becomes a huge part of the liberal agenda, you could say, of this time period. The abolitionist movement really begins amongst a lot of Christian populations in the United States, but really notably in England is where this huge force begins. First, it kind of begins as a small talking point, and then we eventually have some politicians that will kind of hold everyone's hand to the fire and make them actually act on all their talk. I really like this cartoon that makes fun of how the upper classes would claim to support all of these new ideas, but ultimately were hypocrites. So here we have these upper class peoples who are saying all these things about how terrible slavery is, and it's hard to really see all the captions there, but they're sitting around and saying how terrible it is and how they disagree with it. But all the while, as you can see, they're drinking tea, which was just filled with sugar, as Brits at this time consumed even more than we currently consume in terms of sugar, so that's a lot. Also, the one woman is holding brandy, right, which is refined via sugar, right? So showing how ultimately hypocritical they were. It's only when we have certain politicians, most notably William Wilberforce, where we can get a more unified voice against slavery. So William Wilberforce was a politician who didn't really care so much about abolition, but it's said that he had a kind of an enlightenment of his own, or epiphany, becomes a born-again evangelical, and joins a church and kind of applies the concepts of Christianity to politics and begins to lead a more conservative, or rather concerted effort against slavery. He's able to pass a bill that ends the slave trade in 1807, and the British are able to do this by using their navy to police the waters, and any slave ships that were found, they were captured and turned around, or there'd be battles and the like. But as the British Navy was pretty formidable, they're able to subdue this, and slowly over time, we see the more formal abolition movements within other nations, and you have the list of dates in your notes, but France will abolish slavery in 1848, amongst other major social reforms. The US in 65, Cuba in 1886, Brazil not until much later in 1888, and that will have some big social repercussions we'll talk about in the 20th century. It's fairly convenient that the British are kind of poised to do this in this moment because they don't own any colonies that required slaves, and it was kind of a good way to, I don't know, kind of stick it to the Americans. As they did still require slaves. But regardless, it's kind of part and parcel of the social reforms that liberals wanted to enact in this time period. Another major social movement we see is the women's rights movement, slowly brew. We have many beginnings to this. It goes back to Olympe de Gouges in the French Revolution, and even before. But it really takes form starting with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. So we're seeing just how significant that date is in this little lesson here. So Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are known as the main leaders for this, but there are many other people involved. So essentially, they're kind of taking all of these Enlightenment theorists to task and requiring them to come through, right, with their promises of equal representation. What's fascinating to me about this is how little support they received for this until key people such as Frederick Douglass speak on their behalf. And here we see the kind of different sides of civil rights movements coming to each other's aid. Of course, it's not going to be a while until women gain the right to vote, but here we have yet another voice asking for some liberal reforms. So those examples are universal examples of these liberal social movements happening. So abolition, those movements are happening everywhere, and the women's rights movements are happening mostly in the Western worlds, but amongst many of these nations. But then we have multiple localized movements seeking political reforms and social reforms within their nations, and this is a brand new concept in this time period. Before, most people are identifying themselves as part of kingdoms, as part of smaller communities, or more identified as part of their churches, for example. But in this era, we're getting that sense of nationalism or nationhood. And for those classes that watched John Green, we see that he and many others define nationalism as the kind of territorial and cultural ties that bind. However, it's such a difficult thing to study the concept of the nation, as not everybody who lives within a territory feels connected to everyone, and sometimes people who live outside of territories feel more connected to one culture than another. And yet we still are kind of formulating this sense of identity. Many historians attribute the rise of nationalism to the Napoleonic Wars. And as you can see, his invasions were quite extensive. And so by invading these nations that have been becoming far more established in these cultures that have been really developing over time, it created the sense of being threatened. And oftentimes these cultures, while they perhaps at this moment couldn't define exactly who they were, what it meant to be Italian, what it meant to be Austrian, they knew they definitely were not French. And so these kind of Frenchies coming their way made them kind of evaluate themselves and their territories, and such stoked this concept of nationalism slowly over time. So that's kind of one theory in terms of the rise of nationalism. And there are many different types of nationalism. So we have our kind of territorial nationalism, but really before this, of course, we have cultural nationalism. And probably the best example of that is Zionism. So Zionism, or the kind of the Jewish nationalist movement, is really attributed to Theodor Herzl, who was kind of a prominent kind of Hebrew scholar and Jewish diplomat, who was beginning essentially to make the argument that the Jews deserve a Holy Land, because as we know, they had gone through quite a lot over the years. I have some examples of the more ancient issues that they had dealt with, going back to the Crusades and the plague and the like. But in this time period, we kind of see an upswing in violence against Jews. Notably, there are these terrible pogroms, or these intended violent actions that were, if not ordered, were accepted by the state, notably in Russia and in Poland and in Spain. So they're just seeing a ton of violence. There's also the example of the Dreyfus Affair, where essentially there was a scandal in the French military that was all blamed on this one Jewish soldier who it's, now accepted did not do it. So the sense of cultural nationalism that Jews everywhere do have a united culture but are scattered about will also lead to a sense of more territorial Jewish nationalism, as will eventually lead to the establishment of Israel in 1948. Another phase of nationalist activity begins with the revolutions of 1848, which I've hinted towards. This revolutionary activity is also known as the Spring of Nations. So essentially, these are a series of revolutions where we see this kind of ad hoc coalition of reformers and members of the middle class and the working classes come together to show their dissatisfaction with the fact that after the French Revolution and what looked like all these changes, the monarchies rose to power, which we see in the Congress of Vienna and the kind of conservative swing in the kind of 1830s. And so we see a series of revolutions. Now, they did not necessarily change the political structure throughout Europe, but they did change the European societies and cultural mores dramatically. So, in places like France, Germany, the Italian states, Hungary, Poland, and even Brazil, we see these movements arise. So while they won't get direct action, they will inspire things like Italian unification. They'll essentially be the movement that will free the serfs in the Russian Empire. They will eliminate feudalism in Prussia and the Austrian Empire, and things of that nature. The 1848 revolutions began in France, where many frustrated former revolutionaries and newer revolutionaries began to slowly organize via these communes, where working and usually middle-class theorists from various schools of thought, liberals and socialists and anarchists, would come together to voice their various discontents. The kind of most well-known image of all of these revolutions is the Barricade, which is very well known in Les Miserables, if you've seen the play or seen the movie, but we also see it in Hungary and Italy and Belgium and all the places of the 1848 revolution, showing that it is a grassroots revolution. The big issue is that there were a lot of classist issues. So the middle class didn't necessarily represent or care about the working class issues, and that's probably why these things ultimately failed. But, as I did note before, there were some successes somewhat to it, such as, in Hungary, it leads to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and reduce some of the Russian influence. In Italy, the rebellions will eventually inspire unification, and in places like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, we see less kind of serfdom, which is still kind of lurking around, and in places like Denmark, we see a constitutional monarchy that is. It also should be noted that people have made the comparison of the 1848 revolutions with the modern Arab Spring. Especially now that we are a couple years into the Arab Spring, we can also, I think sadly, make the similar comparison that they're not really working. In places like Tunisia, it seems to be working, where they do have successful constitutions being passed, but we do have these sad examples of Egypt, right, where eventually, or at least initially, we made some progress in toppling an original government, but ever since we divided factions. So while maybe not initially successful, these movements, they do spread like wildfire, mostly due to communication technologies. In the case of the 1848 revolutions, it would have been the telegraph and newspapers, and obviously now it would be social media, right? So both spread very quickly, and they'll all introduce new concepts that show the anger of the people and the discontent of the people, although maybe they don't get results. And I think it's notable that these revolutions cross the Atlantic and even end up in Brazil, where we see a revolt against the conservative forces since Brazil, ever since its independence. All we do is become free from Portugal. Nothing had changed. There's still a huge slave population. Most people are living in some measure of servitude. So even in Brazil, getting word from what has happened in Europe, they're going to engage in this revolutionary activity. And finally, we get to our most classic examples of nationalism, which are the nationalist movements that leads to the formation of brand new nation states and the unification specifically of Italy and Germany. So super briefly, the independence and unification of Italy is a process that happens more slowly over time due to the cultural nationalism that exists and the unity that comes from speaking similar languages and, most importantly, sharing a similar religion centered around Roman Catholicism. But beginning in the mid 19th century, we see a movement to unify, mostly because of how vulnerable the principalities of Italy are by being smaller microstates in the age of growing larger states in Europe. So definitely after Napoleon, there starts to be these movements to unify, and as you see, there are multiple military movements that will unify Italy by 1870. The other classic example is that of Germany. The German nationalist movement does have its roots in the early 19th century, where we see German cultural nationalism really brew, the concept of the kind of Zeitgeist, and of course, a celebration of German language. We especially see in the Grimm's fairy tale collection, which becomes one of the most celebrated literary works of Germany. So the Grimm brothers essentially try to collect all of the folk tales and poems and songs that were used in all the Germanic regions. So, parts of Bohemia and Prussia and all of these Germanic states, and combine them to create this, huge compendium of stories, of which we all know. But of course, famously, these stories, which have been Disneyfied in our culture, were very brutal originally. So Cinderella's stepsisters, they're not just kind of comically cramming their foot into the slipper as in the movie, but instead in Grimm's fairy tales, they're chopping their feet off. So kind of pretty brutal, typical German stuff. And essentially the story of Hansel and Gretel couldn't be more frightening. But these are all based in old German folk tales. But in the mid to late 19th century, the German unification is really kind of, all because of one man, Otto von Bismarck, the great German statesman who wanted to create a German state. And he does so via military action by provoking wars between different groups and eventually consolidating everything around the Prussian state, creating the German state that we know today. And he does it via the military. He had this policy, realpolitik, where he believed that everything should be very straightforward, very efficient, which is no surprise, he's German. And he very famously says, "The great questions of the day will not be settled by speeches or majority votes. That was the mistakes of 1848, but by blood and iron," right? So war and industrialization, which become a hallmark of German culture. So he's able to unify the German states under Prussia and begin the German state. What's surprising about him, because you'd think he'd be kind of such a meanie, is he also is the father of the welfare state of Germany. So while he won't tell industrialists what to do with their workers, what to pay them, what we do see is our first social security system and pension systems and sick leave systems to try to alleviate the sufferings of some of the people and also try to stop so many Germans from emigrating to the United States. So in some ways, he's hyper-militaristic. In other ways, he does create a sense of security and love for the nation. And that's really what nationalism is all about, this love and kind of this aggression. And of course, we all know where this ends up. All of this is pushing us to the world wars. All right, so that took a lot longer than I wanted, and I'm really tired. So I hope that cleared up a couple things and made some comparisons that you found helpful. There'll be a little assignment that goes along with this as normal, so look for that, and we'll see you later. Goodbye.